In November 1943, on a strip of sand so small it barely appears on most maps, the United States paid one of the most shocking prices of the Second World War. In just 3 days of fighting, American forces suffered nearly as many casualties as they had endured during the entire 6-month struggle for Guadalcanal. The island was Betio, part of the Tarawa Atoll in the Central Pacific, and it was smaller than New York's Central Park. There were no hills to seize, no forests to hide in, and nowhere to retreat. Yet thousands of U.S. Marines were ordered to storm its beaches under direct fire. The images that emerged afterward, men wading through chest-deep water, bodies floating in blood-stained surf, exhausted survivors clinging to a narrow strip of sand, shocked the American public and forced military leaders to confront an uncomfortable truth. This was not a heroic, clean victory. It was a brutal warning. Tarawa raised a terrifying question. If taking a tiny coral island cost this much, how could the United States possibly fight its way across the Pacific to Japan? By late 1943, the Pacific War had entered a new and decisive phase. Japan's rapid expansion across Asia and the Pacific had been halted. The battles of Midway and the Coral Sea had broken Japanese naval momentum, while American shipyards were now producing warships, aircraft, and landing craft on an unprecedented scale. In the Southwest Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur's forces were securing the approaches to Australia and pushing back through New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. At sea, the U.S. Navy no longer hunted Japanese fleets cautiously. It was preparing for sustained, large-scale offensives. In response, Japan shifted to the defensive and constructed a vast national defense zone stretching across the Pacific. Anchored on island groups like the Marshalls, Gilberts, and Carolines, these islands were more than dots on a map. They were fortified outposts with airfields, artillery, and garrisons designed to function as unsinkable aircraft carriers, capable of bleeding any attacker and enabling counterstrikes from major bases like Truk and Rabaul. For American planners, these islands represented both a threat and an opportunity. Left alone, they could harass supply lines and strike advancing forces. Captured, they could serve as stepping stones toward Japan itself. But taking them meant something the U.S. military had little real experience with: repeated amphibious assaults against heavily defended positions, arguably the most complex and dangerous operation in modern warfare. The U.S. Marines had developed an amphibious doctrine, but until now, most landings had been lightly opposed. This next phase would be different. Every beach could be covered by machine guns, artillery, and mortars. Every mistake would be paid for in blood. The debate over how to proceed was fierce. MacArthur argued that a Central Pacific campaign would divert resources from his own advance. Admirals Chester Nimitz and Ernest King, however, believed that striking directly through the Central Pacific was the fastest way to collapse Japan's defensive perimeter. In January 1943, at the Casablanca Conference, the Allies made their choice. The Central Pacific Offensive was approved, and Admiral Raymond Spruance was placed in command. The first major test of this strategy would be Operation Galvanic, an assault on the Japanese-held Gilbert Islands. Among them was Tarawa. On paper, it seemed like a manageable objective. In reality, it would become a nightmare that reshaped how the United States fought the war and revealed just how costly victory in the Pacific was going to be. Betio Island, the main objective of Operation Galvanic, was small enough to walk across in under an hour, yet it carried enormous strategic weight. Just 5 kilometers long and barely 600 meters wide, it sat flat and exposed, its highest point only 3 meters above sea level. There was no room for maneuver, no depth for defense, and no way to hide mistakes. But what Betio lacked in size, it made up for in firepower. The Japanese had transformed it into a fortress. Nearly 4,850 troops, many of them elite naval infantry, defended the island under the command of Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki. Over the course of 1942 and 1943, they constructed hundreds of bunkers, reinforced gun emplacements, concrete pillboxes, trench systems, anti-boat obstacles, and shore batteries. Every possible landing beach was covered by overlapping fields of fire. Shibazaki was so confident in his defenses that he boasted 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. For the Americans, Betio was a proving ground. Success would open the door to the Marshall Islands and validate the Central Pacific strategy. Failure would raise doubts about island hopping itself. U.S. intelligence pieced together much of the Japanese defensive layout using aerial photography, submarine periscope observations, and information from former British residents. However, critical gaps remained. Many smaller bunkers were invisible from the air, and there was no underwater reconnaissance of reefs or obstacles. Despite these unknowns, planners believed overwhelming naval gunfire and air power would neutralize resistance before the Marines landed. Betio was expected to be tough, but manageable. In reality, it was about to expose the limits of American preparation and the deadly consequences of underestimating a determined defender. Planning the invasion of Tarawa revealed deep tensions within the American command structure. Admiral Chester Nimitz oversaw the Central Pacific Campaign, while Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the operation itself. The amphibious landings were entrusted to two notoriously difficult men, Admiral Kelly Turner, responsible for naval assault forces, and Marine General Holland Howling Mad Smith, commanding the landing troops. Their rivalry was intense and personal, threatening coordination at every level. A compromise was eventually reached. Turner would command until troops were ashore, then Smith would take over. But the uneasy relationship reflected the broader uncertainty surrounding amphibious warfare. The plan called for Marines to land on the northern, lagoon-facing beaches of Betio, designated Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3. These beaches were chosen because they were less heavily fortified than the ocean-facing southern shore. The first assault waves would ride in landing vehicles tracked, or LVTs, capable of crossing coral reefs and delivering troops directly onto the beach. Later waves would follow in shallow draft landing craft. Crucially, planners believed the tide would be high enough for those craft to cross the reef. A warning about a rare ultra-low tide was raised, but dismissed after disagreement among experts. The invasion date remained unchanged. Naval planners scheduled a massive pre-landing bombardment, though far shorter than Marine commanders requested. Aircraft and battleships would soften defenses, then lift fire shortly before the landings. It was an ambitious plan that relied on precise timing, perfect coordination, and favorable natural conditions. Any failure of intelligence, tides, communications, or fire support could prove catastrophic. On the morning of November 20th, 1943, the Marines would discover just how fragile the plan really was. Before dawn on November 20th, American battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened fire on Betio. For 3 hours, shells slammed into the tiny island, while carrier aircraft struck from above. To the Marines waiting offshore, the bombardment looked apocalyptic. Fires burned across the island, and confidence soared. Many believed nothing could survive such punishment, but appearances were deceiving. While large guns and visible structures were damaged, hundreds of well-built bunkers remained intact. Shells often skipped off the hard coral or overshot the narrow target entirely. Worse still, poor coordination and smoke obscured targets, limiting the effectiveness of follow-up airstrikes. As the bombardment lifted, the assault began to unravel. Mechanical problems and rough seas delayed the landing waves, giving the Japanese time to recover and redeploy. When the LVTs finally advanced, they crossed the reef successfully, surprising Japanese defenders who had assumed the reef was impassable. But once inside the lagoon, they came under intense fire. Marines reached the beaches and took cover behind a low seawall, only to find the area pre-sighted by Japanese mortars. Forced forward, they were cut down by machine guns and snipers. Then, disaster struck the later waves. The tide was far lower than expected. Landing craft slammed into the reef and stopped hundreds of meters offshore. With no alternative, Marines climbed out and waded toward the island under fire, weighed down by gear. Many drowned. Others were hit repeatedly in the open water. The lagoon turned red with blood as casualties mounted. Radios failed, officers fell, and command control dissolved. What was meant to be a coordinated assault became a desperate struggle for survival. By late morning on D-Day, the situation on Betio was dire. Marines clung to a few narrow footholds near the beaches, pinned down by fire from all directions. Units were mixed together, leaders were dead or wounded, and communications were unreliable or non-existent. Attempts to reinforce the beachhead only added to the chaos, as more men were forced to wade ashore through gunfire. Casualties skyrocketed, especially among the later waves. One message sent back to division headquarters captured the desperation of the moment. Casualties were estimated at 70%, and the position could not be held. Yet the Marines endured. Small groups advanced bunker by bunker, often improvising under fire. Naval gunfire and airstrikes resumed, dangerously close to friendly lines. The arrival of Sherman tanks late in the day provided desperately needed firepower, blasting open strongpoints that had stalled the advance. The Japanese, though still dangerous, were becoming disorganized. A critical turning point came when Rear Admiral Shibazaki was killed by naval shellfire before he could coordinate a large counterattack. Without centralized command, Japanese resistance became fragmented. Nightfall brought fear of a mass banzai attack that could have swept the Marines into the sea, but it never came. Instead, scattered fighting continued through the darkness. By the next day, the Americans began to gain momentum. Using flamethrowers, demolitions, and close coordination between infantry and tanks, they systematically destroyed bunkers. The fighting was brutal and intimate, often at point-blank range. Progress was measured in meters, but it was progress nonetheless. Tarawa was not yet won, but the balance was finally shifting. Over the next 2 days, the Marines methodically crushed the remaining Japanese defenses. They split the island in two, isolating pockets of resistance. One area, later known simply as the Pocket, became the site of some of the most savage fighting. Japanese defenders, dug into interconnected bunkers and trenches, fought almost to the last man. Bulldozers pushed earth over firing ports, while Marines poured fuel inside and ignited it. It was grim, efficient, and devastating. A final Japanese banzai charge was repelled with heavy losses, marking the end of organized resistance on Betio. When the battle ended after 3 days, the cost was staggering. The United States suffered over 3,400 casualties, including more than 1,100 killed or missing. Nearly 97% of the Japanese garrison was dead. Compared to Guadalcanal, where similar losses had occurred over 6 months, Tarawa was a shock. The American public was unprepared for images of dead Marines published in newspapers for the first time. Critics, including General MacArthur, called the operation an unnecessary massacre. Within the military, blame was debated fiercely. Planning failures, intelligence gaps, tide miscalculations, and poor coordination all came under scrutiny. What Tarawa was not dismissed as a failure. It proved that fortified islands could be taken. LVTs had demonstrated their value. Most importantly, the battle exposed exactly what needed to change. Commanders understood that if the war continued as it had at Tarawa, the cost would be unbearable. Lessons would have to be learned, and fast. The response to Tarawa was immediate and transformative. The U.S. military corrected nearly every failure exposed by the battle. New armored LVTs with ramps and heavier weapons were rushed into production, allowing troops to stay aboard from ship to shore. Underwater demolition teams were created to scout reefs and clear obstacles before landings. Bombardments were extended to days instead of hours and coordinated tightly with airstrikes, continuing until the moment troops hit the beach. Communications improved, command ships were redesigned, and troops carried lighter, more practical loads. These changes were tested just weeks later in the Marshall Islands. At Kwajalein and Eniwetok, the new doctrine worked. Pre-landing bombardments were devastating, resistance collapsed faster, and casualties, while still significant, were far lower than at Tarawa. The contrast was stark. Veterans noted that the Pacific War before 1944 felt like a different conflict entirely. American industrial power was now fully unleashed, and amphibious warfare had become a refined, deadly science. Tarawa marked the beginning of the final phase of the Pacific War. It shattered illusions about easy victories and forced Americans to confront the reality of fighting a determined enemy who would not surrender. The lessons learned there saved countless lives in later battles, but they came at an awful price. The blood spilled on that tiny island ensured that future landings would not repeat the same mistakes. Tarawa was a flawed victory, but without it, the road to Japan would have been far deadlier. Tarawa was not the end of the Pacific War, and it was not even its largest battle, but it may have been its most important lesson. On a strip of coral smaller than a city park, the United States discovered the true cost of fighting across the Pacific. The victory exposed brutal realities, that Japanese defenses could absorb immense punishment, that amphibious warfare left no margin for error, and that even overwhelming industrial power could not guarantee an easy landing. For the Marines who survived, Tarawa was not remembered as a triumph, but as a test of endurance in which survival itself felt uncertain. Yet Tarawa also changed everything. The blood spilled there forced the U.S. military to adapt with extraordinary speed. New landing vehicles, better intelligence, longer bombardments, underwater demolition teams, and tighter coordination between ships, aircraft, and ships, and ground troops transformed how America fought. Just weeks later in the Marshall Islands, those lessons saved lives. The war did not become easy, but it became winnable. As one veteran observed, there were effectively two Pacific Wars, the one before Tarawa and the one after it. The battle also shattered comforting illusions at home. Americans could no longer believe the enemy was weak, or that victory would come without sacrifice. Tarawa made it clear that every island on the road to Japan would demand blood, and that the price of final victory would be high. The young Marines and soldiers who fought there had been pulled into a global conflict that began years earlier, driven by decisions made in Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo. Understanding why the world descended into such destruction is essential to understanding why battles like Tarawa happened at all. Tarawa was a flawed victory, born of miscalculation and paid for in lives, but it reshaped the war. It forced the United States to learn how to fight and how to survive in the most unforgiving theater of the Second World War. The long road across the Pacific continued, but after Tarawa, it would